The views and content expressed on the Pop Culture Courtroom are provided solely for educational and entertainment purposes and do not constitute legal advice. For any legal matters, please consult with a licensed attorney.
Welcome back to the Pop Culture Courtroom. I'm Matt Hardin, and today we have with us Lauren Kilgore, who's the Senior Vice President of Sony Music and a longtime entertainment lawyer.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Lauren and I are couple friends. Our children all go to the same school and have been friends for many years. Because we are parents of smaller children, we have seen probably every animated movie ever made at this point.
Multiple times.
And today's movie we're going to do, frankly, is my favorite of all the cartoon-type movies we've watched, which is Coco. So Coco is a Pixar movie that came out in 2017, and it involves a story of the Rivera family, specifically Miguel Rivera, who is a young boy about 12 years old that's an aspiring musician. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, in his past, his great-great-grandfather left the family to pursue his dream, never came home, died young. Classic
musician story. He pursues his career as a musician and abandons his family. Starting off on a high note.
So great-grandmother Imelda Rivera
right.
Ends up going into the shoemaking business, and they ban music in their house.
From their whole family, right. No music.
Which has been carried on by his own grandmother, the Abuelita, who, anytime he's even trying to blow on a bottle or something, she's like, no music.
Right.
So we start in this small town with young Miguel trying to pursue a career in music. He's made his own guitar. He wants to enter a local talent show they're having on the day.
He's taught himself to play.
By watching old movies involving his favorite musician ever, De La Cruz.
Yeah, Ernesto de la Cruz, who is apparently this, massive star at that time period.
So the original great-great-grandfather, Hector, left behind a young daughter named Coco, who is still living at around age 90 or so, and she is the great-grandmother of Miguel.
Right.
So
living with the family, aging, elderly, yes.
Losing her mind a bit.
Sensibilities.
I will say that the family community in this is wonderful. I mean, other than this band of music, they're very tight-knit. The aunts and uncles, the cousins are all about. They're all involved in the shoemaking business.
They all sort of live together or nearby. They're, very close-knit community.
And so Miguel is trying to figure out a way to play in this music that goes to the ofrenda on one particular day. When Coco is in there because he's trying to hide from his family. There's a local dog, Dante. He's a street dog that we find out
about that dog.
He has some magical qualities later, but during this,
right.
He's actually eating food off the ofrenda where the family leaves things that the deceased relatives had enjoyed during their life. So he's eating that, and while trying to pull Dante away from it, the picture at the top, which has Mama Melda and Coco as a baby, but the head of the musician torn off, falls over, breaks, reveals what appears to be De La Cruz's guitar.
Right. So he matches them up, right? And there is the miraculous discovery about his heritage.
That's right. And so he ends up going to the mausoleum because De La Cruz was from his hometown before he became a world-famous musician, where the guitar he could see through a window into the mausoleum,
right.
Where he goes in and decides to borrow or steal the guitar to play it at the local festival.
Because he didn't have one, which I will say was a heartbreaking scene in the film, is where they discover him playing music and his grandmother is outraged, and as part of that outrage, she smashes the guitar that he had been playing with and learning to play with, which was so heartbreaking.
Right, Miguel learns how to play guitar by watching De La Cruz play in his movies, which is amazing that a kid that young would have the drive to do that, which tells you how much he cared about the music he was doing.
So therefore, he doesn't have a guitar now to compete in the talent show,
right.
And borrows, I guess you said, Ernesto de la Cruz's guitar.
Well, and as always in the world, stealing from dead people, not such a good thing. So he ends
not in this case for sure.
He ends up becoming part of the land of the dead, not really alive, not really dead. He immediately meets his relatives. They travel over across the bridge of marigold flowers to try to see what they can do to help him.
Right. Yeah. And does that happen on the Day of the Dead itself?
Happens on the Day of the
that
Dead.
celebratory day. Right. So he crosses over into the land of the dead.
Well, and the Day of the Dead, or Day of Dead as they call it in Mexico, is all about honoring the relatives that have died before, honoring their memory, and it's a wonderful tradition. But we find out as we get into the land of the dead that once no one living remembers you from when you were alive, you disappear forever into some unknown final death, which even the skeletons that are in the land of the dead are afraid of.
Right, and that's the importance of the ofrenda, is to keep those memories alive every single year so that you're passing down those memories as well.
And it's frankly a lovely sentiment that you're remembering the people that came before. You know, he gets to meet all these uncles and aunts and his great-great-grandmother when he goes over there, and they are still trying to support them despite being dead people up in the land of the dead. So we're going to look at a couple of incidents today, both from an injury standpoint and from how an entertainment lawyer would look at particular claims in this movie. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is the death of De La Cruz. So we're in the early 1940s at this point. He's become a worldwide star, and he is singing the song "Remember Me," which we hear throughout this movie.
His most famous song, right?
His most famous song, which we'll talk
with
about,
air quotes, right?
Which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And
a song that he sings, right?
A song that he sings that was extremely popular. You know, we see audience members swooning about it. And then ultimately we see a stagehand swooning as well, goes against a lever, drops a gigantic bell on him, and gets his bell rung in the ultimate fashion.
That is how he is killed.
That is how he is killed. So he...
Sort of, and doesn't it take place in like this kind of huge arena? You know, he has this massive production. It's sort of the height of De La Cruz's fame. You know, and he gets all the way to the top of this giant pyramid with all of his dancing, women, and then... right as he hits the high note, the bell falls and crushes him to death.
Well, at least he, it's quite the finale. He got to sing his song. He could have dropped that bell on him right in the middle of it.
Right. A little dramatic for the children watching, but yes.
Right. They don't really show anything. He kind of disappears under the bell. And I don't remember what you call the ringer thing in the middle, but my suspicion is that's what got him. So De La Cruz goes to the afterlife. You know, he somehow has a giant mansion there as well. And all the people like, Hector, who becomes our other main character than Miguel in the afterlife, if you're not being remembered, they have like a borderline slum area that they stick them in. People
are sort of, drifting away and fading away, right?
So I want to talk about two things with you. First, we have a wrongful death claim for the death of De La Cruz, who is at this point a world-famous musician. We are going to look at this under copyright laws in the United States, or that'd be federal laws, and then we're going to look at it as wrongful death laws in most of our states, or how we would look at it specifically in Tennessee. So,
I'm absolutely not an expert on Mexican intellectual property law, so I will be operating under U.S. law for purposes of this fact analysis.
Fair enough. For purposes of Pop Culture Courtroom, we'll be thrilled with that.
Yes.
So, wrongful death claim. In Tennessee, you have 1 year from the date of the death, or one date of injuries that end up leading to the death, to bring that lawsuit. It is prior to there being a statute that protected that claim. The claim is the dead person's. So the claim that the death of De La Cruz belongs to De La Cruz. So absent the saving, of the wrongful death statute coming out, you would have no case for that. So Tennessee and all other states in the United States eventually came up with a mechanism where you could sue for wrongful death. And in this case, the heirs of De La Cruz, of which we see none of them, here in this movie. He seems quite surprised when he's told by Miguel in the movie that he's his great, when he thinks he's his great-great-grandson.
But he doesn't say, that's a good point, because he doesn't say, well, there's no possible way that you could be my great-great-grandson, right? He seems surprised, but also... not 100% surprised.
So what I took from this rated G Pixar movie here on our family podcast
family-friendly
was
podcast.
Maybe De La Cruz had some temporary friends when he was on the road, and there's the possibility.
That seems likely. So there was not a 0% chance he could have a great-great-grandson.
So the claim normally is going to go to wife and children if you've died intestate in Tennessee, which means without a will. Mm-hmm. And so if he had a wife, the claim would go to her, but she would not actually get all the money from this. This is a case worth probably, given his stardom level, tens of millions of dollars for what his death would have cost.
Right.
So no wife, children, if there are any, goes to them. But the wife, if there's children, has to split the estate with the children as part of that, is dying without a will, with the wife getting no less than a third if there, say, are 3 children. So it would go to the statutory next of kin. So there's a list that goes, from wife, then to children, and then maybe parents, then siblings, then you start getting into cousins and uncles and all that. So someone has a phenomenal claim. So this is in the 1940s. May not have been pursued in the way it would be now.
How so?
Because there weren't the same level of those type of lawsuits at that time. There's a very famous injury to one of the greatest golfers of all time, which is a man named Ben Hogan, who's under any metric, one of the top 10 golfers ever, where he was in a very bad Greyhound crash where the bus tried to go on a 1-lane road and pass somebody, and Ben Hogan threw himself over his wife in the other seat, which saved his life because the steering column went and pressed against the back. I've read 3 or 4 biographies on him, and no one has ever talked about the fact that, that he pursued a lawsuit on this.
Really?
And if you look at the history of our country, it would have been much more unusual for there to have been a serious injury, wrongful death case at that time period, and the value of them would have been much less likely. So like Ben Hogan didn't have anything. He ended up winning some more majors on that, but he spent the rest of his life in chronic massive pain where he had to do all these things to even play golf. De La Cruz, at this point, 20 years after they started, probably in his 40s. It appears that when people go to the afterlife, they kind of stay whatever age they are.
Right, they're just frozen in time, immortal time.
So come back to the wrongful death suit. What are we looking at with damages here? You have, of course, your loss of life expectancy, things like that. Your relationships will be tied into that you had with your family that they have lost. You have the future income related to singing, which is going to be somewhat hard to extrapolate. Although, could you make an estimate on what value of a superstar's future catalog is worth?
Yeah, absolutely you can. I mean, you would just be primarily start by looking at historical earnings, right? To see from all revenue sources, at the time it would have been composition, if he's receiving income from the compositions, from exploitation of his recordings, from his performances, from any other adjacent rights, that he's monetizing, his name, image, and likeness. You can look at those past 3 or 5 years and make projections on, what you think he was going to continue to earn.
Appears to be super popular. This is, if it's around 1942, I think it's happening. At the time this movie comes out, it's 75 years later. And people still love him.
He's still super famous, right? He has a lot of longevity. Very few stars have that sort of star power.
My comparison I could come up with is the best one would be Bing Crosby. And so, Bing was a superstar of the 20s, 30s, and 40s who still every Christmas has songs chart, everything from White Christmas, mostly his Christmas catalog.
Yeah. Who else would have been around that time? Like, I guess Sinatra was a little bit later, but Frank Sinatra or Elvis, right? It still has a huge
I think that's the comparison. I think those are the good comparisons.
Right. The Elvis of Mexico, right?
Yeah, right.
Not as risque.
Now, I will say, when I was at law school at UT, there was a Mexican Elvis impersonator named Elvez. And he was phenomenal.
You need to dig out some video of Elvez.
In the Barrio was the song that I remember him playing, but it was this tiny little bantamweight of a man, and he was great. It was a lot of fun.
Really?
So I think those are apt comparisons, but you have even, I think Elvis has sold, that catalog has been sold in the last 10 years or so.
Right. The estate, there are lawyers in the entertainment practice that specialize in managing the estates of deceased artists. And so, Johnny Cash's estate is managed by some excellent lawyers here in town. But certainly, right, those rights continue to be monetized. And you think, too, the way technology had changed from the time of De La Cruz's life until Miguel's life, right? There are new technologies that might revitalize or offer new opportunities to monetize the same intellectual property assets. And so control of those assets is super important.
When Elvis actually died intestate, he died in his early 40s in Memphis, and they actually appointed a conservator, a local attorney in Memphis, who basically spent the rest of their career managing Elvis's affairs for Lisa Marie very, very well, along with her, her mother, who I think did quite a bit to help with that.
Yeah.
But that was basically a judicial appointment that somebody got to manage that estate.
I mean, for example, without disclosing any specifics, there was an artist who had some success in the 90s who had an untimely death very young, and his mother continues to manage his estate. There was an Airbnb. We got noticed an Airbnb that was going to pop up in a place where that artist had been. There was some publications about it, and they were going to be using the name of this artist as like the artist had lived here, and this was actually the city where he had died. And, we were able to send essentially a warning letter to those entrepreneurs and say, okay, you can do whatever you want with your property, but you cannot use the name, image, and likeness, any of the recordings, any of those assets that belong to the estate, even though he had died many, many, many years ago.
Is there a limitation on the time period that you'd be able to have an artist like De La Cruz and name, image, and likeness, or is that something that goes on to the family
No,
forever?
those rights, those are perpetual. You can assign them, and there's some debate now about whether assignment of your name, image, and likeness rights in conjunction with recording or other types of agreements are in perpetuity. You can never get them back. So that's a bit unsettled, but generally those descend and you can exploit those.
What about his musical compositions themselves that he would have had the 1920s through the 40s, as far as where we are in this place in the movie, that he's left behind, things like Remember Me, his recordings of those? How do those go with after an artist dies?
Well, if we're assuming that he, for purposes of now, that he is the owner of those compositions, then yes, those would be able to descend just like any other property, right? They're intangible. It's intangible property, right? The composition itself. But yes, the ownership of that would also pass to his heirs.
So I've read before about copyrights running out, like famously with the Disney characters, Mickey Mouse, I think had reached some period years ago where it was going to go into the public domain. Is that an issue with songs, or is that something that you can reset the date on that to move it forward?
So not to be overly complicated, but there's a couple of things that the Copyright Act, which is, in the copyright protection originates from the Constitution, but there are several statutes that apply to govern those rights. So for purposes of where we are, let's assume that he created those songs, in 1940 or 1920, whenever that was. Then the protections for that would fall under the 1909 Copyright Act. And
is that federal or state law?
That is federal. And now, all copyright claims are exclusively federal. And so there's no common law, copyright law, or state copyright law. They're all subsumed.
So federal versus state law. State law would be with your individual state, like Tennessee or wherever you're from, passes a law. Federal law comes from the federal government in one way or another, usually passed through Congress.
Right.
And federal law trumps state law always.
Right. And some claims have to be exclusively brought in the federal courts, and copyright claims are one of those types of claims. So, under the 1909 Act, there is a balance that the Copyright Act is trying to achieve, and that is the balance to incentivize creators to create their works by giving them some protection, but then also enabling those works to benefit the public. So the compromise that has been reached is with respect to how long do authors get those copyright protections. And under the 1909 Act, without getting into too much detail, it's typically from 95 years from the date of publication. So for your example, while everybody else is, celebrating New Year's Eve every year, copyright lawyers are looking at all of the works that are going to fall into the public domain as of January 1 that following year, because the 95-year term from publication has expired, right? So you're seeing works from 1929, I guess now doing my math, which may be imprecise, are going to be coming into the public domain.
Is there any way to extend that time period?
No, not now. It has been extended. So initially, the 1909 Act's term was an initial term of 28 years. That could be renewed for another 28 years. That was extended. And under the 1976 Act, originally, they changed that time period to be, you would get federal copyright protection from the life of the author plus 50 years. There was a subsequent statute which Sony Bono was involved in, which you may have heard of, that extended it to 70 years. So it's life of the author plus 70 years. And when that period is over, that's it. You can't extend it unless, there's another statute passed or something like that. But
Well, if De La Cruz is becoming a star in the 1920s, he's got songs that from this
Right.
fictional world that are likely going into the public domain.
right, depending
now.
on when they were published. And it, not to be overly lawyerly about it, but, what is a publication? That's also a bit more complicated than you might just think, oh, I published it, therefore federal copyright protection applies. One thing that's important about the 1909 Act is there were some pretty strict formalities associated with getting federal copyright protection. So not only, the work had to be published to get protection, but you had to attach this little copyright symbol, which I'm sure the notice, which people are familiar with, the little C with the circle around it. And if you failed to do that, your work went into the public domain. So the 1976 Act, which applies to works created from 1978 forward, got rid of some of those formalities and covers a broader range of works as well.
All right, so riddle me this. Taylor Swift re-recorded a lot of her music when she got into a stir with her previous production folks that owned her music.
Right.
How does that work with the original version of it versus, say, the Taylor version of music?
Well, from a term standpoint, that's not related. So that is essentially a contractual provision in recording agreements. The re-record restriction just says, and now I can tell you there's been a change in that restriction based on what Taylor did. So she's changed how these agreements are worded, not surprisingly, but most of the recording agreements will say whatever you record for us under the deal, right? And we own everything, and there's an assignment language, and the writer assigns everything over, which we can talk about that in a second. But for some period of time after the term of the agreement ends, you cannot record those same songs. So Taylor waited. Once those contractual limitations expired, she began recording the albums that she could, right? She couldn't record them all at once, right? Because it would probably be tiered based on, some period of time after release, right? So the album was released, you got to wait 10 years before you can re-record, or 5 years, or whatever's contractually negotiated. And so you saw as those contractual periods expired, she began re-recording her albums, and then she just bought them all back.
So my strong suspicion is some very smart lawyer like yourself told her that she could do that, and then she recorded them, and she has such great public will that it worked out for her.
Yeah, she's unique, I think, in that, to be able to finance the re-recording exactly, she tried to make them as similar as the original recordings, but then also to have the star power to direct your fan base to listen to those recordings and sort of cannibalize the other recordings. That had never really happened. And so a star of her stature was able to do that. The change in some of the recording agreements is now that the re-record restrictions will say you can't record these songs, re-record them for some period of time. And even after that re-record time period expires, you cannot record a substantially similar or identical recording to those original recordings.
That's really interesting.
So you can go back and make a lot, some kind of other version or an alt version or remix version, but you can't just make an identical version. So not all agreements have that, but I've seen that language in some contracts.
Wow. As far as case or no case, 100% there is a case for the death of De La Cruz from the Bell. I would be remarkably delighted to have the family De La Cruz walk into my office and say, Senior Hardin, we'd like to hire you for this.
Right.
It would make my year.
Right.
It would make my decade.
No, yeah, I was going to say it might make your career, right?
So,
your retirement even.
The main issue is going to be, does this venue, and given the type of venues we have in modern times, a lot of them are owned by a consortium, so they're probably going to be very well insured, have serious assets.
Absolutely, they would. Yeah.
That looks like a very fancy venue for the 1940s, so the likelihood of them having some sort of insurance or assets you can go after is high. So case, absolutely phenomenal case. Call me, De La Cruz family, if you're out there in the fictional world.
Matt Hardin Law.
So as far as the copyright issues, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, from a property, copyrights are property rights, even though the property is not like, something tangible. There's a difference between like the actual physical sound recording that you hold in your hand, your CDs for those 90s kids that had those, and the intellectual property, but those rights are descendable the way that other property is. And so assuming he has heirs and assuming he can establish ownership, those would descend to his heirs.
All right. Our second incident we're going to talk about today is the murder of Hector Rivera. So Hector is played in this movie by Gael Garcia Bernal very, very well.
Yeah, he's a great character.
It's a perfectly cast movie. I mean, everybody in it is great. Benjamin Bratt, who's a longtime TV actor,
right?
Plays De La Cruz in it, and they both sing.
He's great. Yeah, they both sing.
Outstanding manner.
The music in the film is excellent. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I highly recommend it.
Every song is great. Apparently, originally they were not going to have Miguel sing in this movie at all, and the actor that they hired to play Miguel came in and he could sing really well, so they rewrote the movie specifically. And I didn't know that. I cannot imagine this movie working as well without him being a singer.
And Miguel meets him once he comes, over into the afterlife, just sort of coincidentally, right? They hit it off right away musically and start performing together at one of the talent shows, and their relationship is really fun to watch.
So I watched this movie again in preparation for our podcast today, and I've seen it lots of times.
I have too.
my girls especially love this movie. And the one thing I noticed that I'd never noticed before, so Dante, I'm going to mispronounce this, the Alabrije, I think is how they pronounce it. It's like the magical creature animals in the afterlife.
Right.
Dante, we find out later, is one of these Alabrije, despite the fact that he's kind of a
goofy dog,
mangy street dog. But one thing he does that's really interesting is he is very calm if Hector and Miguel are together. And if they separate, he goes crazy.
Oh, I haven't noticed that. No.
And so I think his whole spirit guide dog stuff is he's trying to get those two together to get to where their journey goes. And this whole movie is just a love story to family.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. He's even affecting the afterlife of his great-great-grandfather with his own decisions. And the great-great-grandfather is basically mentoring Miguel on how to be a musician.
Right.
That first song they go to sing, that they sang together, in Poco Loco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fun song.
He tells him to shake his hands out.
Well, he wants to sing Remember Me, right? And Hector says, no. Everybody wants to sing that one, right? Everybody in the contest is singing that one. Let's do a different one.
And we don't know at this point that that's a song he wrote about Coco.
Right. And you do sense in the film that, Hector has a disdain for De La Cruz. It's not really identified why. And Miguel's whole mission, right? Because when he meets his ancestors in the afterlife, they still are of the no music mindset, and they want to send him back. As long as he won't play any music, they will send him back to the land of the living. And he says no, and runs away from them to find De La Cruz, right? Because he thinks De La Cruz is his grandfather, and his grandfather will understand him. And so kind of the backdrop is that he meets Hector along that journey to find De La Cruz, so that he can, send him back, and he can play music when he gets back to the end of the living.
Right. So Miguel believes wrongfully that De La Cruz is his great-great-grandfather.
Based on the photo.
The photo, it's got a picture of what is De La Cruz's guitar. But if you look at the guitar, it's got, the skeleton with the teeth, and it's got a gold tooth. And I had never noticed this before, but they show very prominently early in the afterlife, Hector has a gold tooth.
Right. Just little Easter eggs that, you have to have small children and watch this movie 50 times before you pick up.
And if you have small children and they like a movie, you watch them all 50 times.
Right.
So they go on this journey to find De La Cruz, and we ultimately find out that when Hector decides he's going to go back to Imelda and his young
Because
daughter,
they were partners. They were co-writers and co-performers together, right?
I don't think they were co-writers. I think they were just co-performers.
We don't know, but yes.
Because we basically find out at the end that he's stolen all his music.
Right. Certainly the most popular songs.
He says he's going to leave, poisons him as he says he's going to leave and go back to his family, which kind of begs the question, why does De La Cruz randomly have poison on his body at the time of this critical juncture when they're, they seems like they've come from playing a gig or something, and he just happens to have some poison on him to pour in their shots they do?
Yeah. He had planned it, obviously. It was premeditated.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe Hector had been saying that he's going to do that, and he had thought that he'd try to convince him to stay, and if not, he'd...
Yeah, and it was clear that Hector was the creative force, and De La Cruz was the singer and the personality, and so he was completely reliant on Hector for his career, and, he took his life over it.
We have another injury, wrongful death case here. Hector does not know until late in this movie that De La Cruz murdered him.
Right, he doesn't know. He thinks he's sick from some food or something like that because there's like a running joke in the film that he like ate a bad chorizo, right?
That's right. They make fun of him for it.
He died from that.
Thought he died from it, and it's Miguel that helps put this together to where he finds out he's murdered by him because De La Cruz, being the narcissist he is, put the exact conversation that he had had with Hector right before he killed him into one of his movies.
Right.
So as far as the case here for a wrongful death case, typically you're going to have, as we talked about earlier, 1 year statute of limitations from the wrongful death itself. It can be extended for various reasons. This, at this point, has been 85 years or so since, De La Cruz killed him. That's well past the 1 year statute of limitations in Tennessee, and other states in our country may have 2 or 3 years on wrongful death. Is there an exception to that? Well, there's multiple exceptions. The only one that potentially could apply here would be the fraudulent concealment of it. And one of the main factors you look at in fraudulent concealment of this death would be whether or not someone could have figured it out, even though De La Cruz is fraudulently concealed, that if there's for some other means. So we're talking about early 1920s in Mexico. What is the way you figure out how somebody died these days?
Just investigate forensically, right? We didn't have any of that evidence back
So
then.
forensic investigation on a wrongful death case like this is almost always going to be an autopsy. An autopsy is going to likely determine whether or not he was
poisoned.
Poisoned versus just some bad sausage, which, how bad is the sausage that it killed him?
Right, and he believed it. When he got to the afterlife, he's like, yeah, that must make sense. That's what happened.
Those of us who've ever been food poisoned, and I got food poisoned by shellfish one time, will never forget that lovely experience.
Yeah.
Did not die from it. Felt like it.
So maybe not so unrealistic.
But it's unlikely that food poisoning is going to kill you most of the time. So being basically 100 years ago, no investigation, it's not really even clear that the family knew what happened to him. They knew he never came back. So I looked a little bit at the Tennessee law on the fraudulent concealment stuff. Catholic diocese cases came up with some of the long-term fraudulent concealment of some of the incidents that happened here and other places.
Interesting.
Where they were allowed to proceed with those cases. There's been a Supreme Court case here. It looked at in the medical malpractice world, which is more the injury, wrongful death world we're talking about here, where the Supreme Court found that with fraudulent concealment, it was one where a physician had actually forged and changed a note where he'd made a bad diagnosis. He went back in the records, changed it into what it should have been, and then they found out somehow. The problem with that one was the family sat on it for more than the Supreme Court said it extended the statute, but you still missed it.
Wow.
And so it ended up going anywhere. I could not find a case where, like this, a straight murder has happened, whether there's a civil case there. But I think you could apply that fraudulent concealment to it and at least potentially have something with it. There are what we call equitable court actions that can be done, where the court looks at the different equities of what's going on and then figures out and applies this type of thing, which is what the fraudulent concealment law is. And if they can overcome what's called the statute of repose for medical malpractice, which is the outside period even more than statute of limitations, doesn't even look at when you figure out the injury. So a typical statute of limitations injury is a year from the date of the injury or the date you discovered that you were injured.
Right.
Statute of repose is an absolute 3 years from the incident, no matter what happened.
Regardless.
Absent fraud. And then I think retained objects is one of the exceptions.
So some narrow exceptions.
Some very narrow exceptions, but we have fraud come back. So I would at least try to make the argument. I still like De La Cruz's case better of the two, but as far as case or no case on the injury part of it, I'd look really hard at it and try to make something work with it. On the murder side of things, there is no statute of limitations in Tennessee and most other states for capital crimes that are punishable by death.
Right.
And so this murder, had De La Cruz still been alive and they were able to prove it, he could still be, they could still go forward on a criminal action against him, but he's long dead too.
Right.
So what about this giant quagmire that's opened up related to the copyright laws? So in this, like at the end of the movie, we find out when Mama Coco, Miguel comes back, they sing a remarkably touching Remember Me together.
Oh my gosh, that scene made me burst into tears completely unexpectedly watching the movie for the first time with my 3-year-old at the time. She's now 10. And I just, as soon as that song played, I just remember like, I just burst into tears. And my daughter was like, Mommy, what is wrong? I was like, it is so touching.
Well, in Hector, one of the central conflicts of this film is that he's being forgotten by everyone that knew him. And the last person on earth that knows him is
Coco.
Is Coco,
right.
And she has dementia.
And she's barely verbal. Right. Exactly.
And I've, my mother had dementia. You eventually get to where you can't talk at all, which
right.
is a horrible thing. The doctors refer to it as a curtain being drawn across your relative slowly, and I think that's very accurate.
I hadn't heard that.
Terrible way to talk about it, but it's very true. So Coco doesn't recognize Miguel. She doesn't recognize her own daughter.
Not
for
anyone,
much of this.
really. Right.
But this recognition of music with someone who has Alzheimer's or dementia it's a real thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's a testament to the way music can really touch people. And this particular song, Remember Me, was written by her father to her to remember
right.
him why he was on the road.
Right.
But that jogs her memory, and she pulls out these letters, this picture of her father to put on the ofrenda when all hope seems lost, and they make
right.
it work. It's wonderful.
And then there's all this evidence, of the compositions that Hector had written while he was alive. And the evidence of essentially that he had written them, right? Because we know that the compositions had been performed, so we can assume that they had been published, which would have been a prerequisite for copyright protection under the 1909 Act at that time. But this was evidence of his authorship. And the Copyright Act does make a distinction between owners and authors. And you'll see a lot of times, in the modern day, the owners of compositions are usually publishers, and then the authors are the songwriters, right? On the recording side, the owners are typically record labels or other entities that are financing the production of those recordings, and the authors are, the artists who are singing or the musicians that are playing on those recordings.
So they've been purchased by the recording studios. So how would that work in this case where if we're making the assumption that Hector has copyrighted these, they are then stolen by De La Cruz, where there's also a performance aspect to mm-hmm. it, both on him going on tours and that potentially being licensed for movies because he was in entertainment things, as well as selling at that time what would have been albums.
Right. So what we would say, typically looking at this, is that Hector was the original author, and so as soon as those were published, right, there was federal copyright protection. It's broader under the 1976 Act. So De La Cruz, gets rid of him and uses, and we would say he's misappropriated and exploited these works without the consent of the owner, which is infringement. So we wouldn't necessarily use terms like he stole the songs, although colloquially you might hear that. And you can do that, in part or in whole, right? So from an infringement standpoint, you might steal or misappropriate a riff from a song you like, or a catchy lyric or something like that. And we don't say you've stolen it; rather, it's been misappropriated, and you're infringing the original work.
So, as far as how do you untangle this giant web between Hector writing these songs, copywriting them, being murdered, and then the career of De La Cruz singing them, using them in movies, putting them on albums, being the performer?
Right.
How do you separate that out?
So De La Cruz is never the owner. He's never the owner of either the composition or the sound recordings that embody those compositions. And copyright law distinguishes between these two different copyrights, which some people don't know. You get a song and you think of it as, one work, but there's two separate copyrights. There's a copyright in the composition and a copyright in the sound recordings. And so, the owner of the composition is its author, the owner of the recording is its author. So it might be that, Hector wrote the original songs, and there is some recording only of De La Cruz that Hector may not own, right? We don't know if, De La Cruz was in a record deal or whatever the equivalent of that would have been at the time. Then it's probably owned by some third party. He might have been able to purchase them. But those are two separate copyrights. And sound recordings actually were not protected under federal copyright law until 1972. So this would have been, state copyright law at the time that was protecting these pre-1972 sound recordings. But Hector is always the owner of the composition. And that is powerful because in order to exploit the composition, right, you have to get rights from the songwriter. And I can talk a little bit about the compulsory mechanical licenses, but cover songs are sort of an exception to that. Once a song has been released, anybody can record it and cover it, but they have to pay the songwriter. So Hector is always the author, as we find out, unless under the copyright law, you cannot assign your ownership of a work unless you do so in writing. There's a writing requirement under the Copyright Act. You don't have to have like magic language necessarily, but it has to say something along the lines of a transfer, a grant, an assignment. There's no such thing as equitable copyright assignment. I've had some people make that argument in cases. And so if there's no writing, Hector is the author and he owns those songs. We don't know quite what happened with the sound recordings. It's possible De La Cruz owns them, but he probably would not be able to exploit them without permission from Hector.
How would it work as far as the timing, given that this has been 90 years at this point, roughly?
Yeah, so there's been a question that's not resolved about tolling of the statute of limitations. There's a recent Supreme Court case about those time periods and whether it's a 3-year look back, whether the statute of limitations can be tolled. The general consensus right now is it is not. You have to bring your claim 3 years from the act of infringement. And so there's a couple of jurisdictions that have told based on certain circumstances, but also the Copyright Act empowers people to police their own works, right? So unless there is like a fraud, essentially, where you're really actively hiding your exploitation of the work, which would be difficult because you're trying to monetize it, right? Then there is a burden on the owner of the copyright to police their works as well. So the discovery rule doesn't apply so much in the copyright context.
Yeah, and I wondered as well, I mean, Coco was very small. I mean, she appeared to be maybe 3-4 years old at the time this was going on.
Very small child.
When she has Hector in there singing to her before he died. Well, we find out later in this movie that he has sent these songs in letters to her. So from a legal standpoint, I mean, you're not letting a 3 and 4 year old. I mean, she can't read.
Right.
I mean, we both have, I have a 7-year-old, you have a 6-year-old. I wouldn't call their reading level stellar as they finish, just finished first grade.
Hey, speak for your own children. No, I'm kidding.
I don't think she's reading complicated lyrics,
Right.
Music lyrics, and understanding them without, Mama Melda probably reading them to her, which is what's really going on at that age. So she actually would have heard those songs be released as this superstar releases a song, especially the one that's about her daughter.
Right, but the whole premise was that they had no music rights, so she's shut herself off from hearing any music, right?
That's fair. These letters predated that music being released. Everything in this world shows that this Remember Me song is like one of the most popular songs ever made.
Right.
And so maybe do you know that that's about your daughter?
Right.
I don't know how you know how you avoid that. So it's kind of a flaw in this argument about
a little bit.
If notice was required, you said that that's something you would not look at. They got notice.
Right.
And so in the injury world or wrongful death world, that'd be a big deal, but it does not sound like it's as big a deal in yours.
No, it's not.
So what about this fraudulent concealment thing? Could that potentially be applied here where there's likely other songs that, Hector had in his notebook of songs that were not in letters to Coco?
No, I mean, we don't really use the fraudulent concealment as far as from a litigation standpoint. I mean, you're really looking at when the songs are exploited, does the person who's exploiting them have the right to do so or not? There have been a couple of jurisdictions, like I said, have made this kind of tolling argument about the discovery rule, and there was no way for us to find out that our works were being infringed, and most of the courts have said no.
My bet is this is such an unusual circumstance. I mean, how often are you going to have a poison murder of someone who becomes a superstar musician, becomes very popular to the level that De La Cruz was? I don't think this incident happens very often.
Right, and you might also make the argument that, notwithstanding the concealment, once it becomes clear that he is an author of the work, putting aside some other procedural hurdles he might have to get through, he has a claim for an accounting. And so the family of Hector could go to the estate of De La Cruz and say, these works have been exploited for the last X number of years. You have generated X amount of money. that money must be accounted to the owner of those songs, right? As publishing royalties. The separate exploitation of the, let's assume there are recordings at this time, that's a different question, right? But for the compositions, yeah, I think you could make an argument that there's an accounting and he has to account. And there's a different question about the statute of limitations on how far back you can go for a royalty accounting. It's different than bringing a claim. So,
well, in royalties accrue as the music keeps getting
They
played,
do.
keep getting used in new TV shows, on radios, streaming,
Right.
whatever you
New
have.
medium, right? Like new technology. There's all different new ways that you could monetize those assets, right?
Well, and plus, an artist of this stature, somebody would probably be willing to. We're talking about Taylor Swift, might buy that whole catalog.
Right.
And so that could be a tremendous amount of money if it's something you think is going to can be used in medium going forward.
Certainly.
So as far as case or no case,
There's a case. Yeah, there's absolutely a case. It is kind of interesting, though, to think about just from the recording standpoint, right? And the performance money also falls into the composition bucket. So, copyrights is sort of a bundle of rights. So you have the right to distribute, you have the right to publish, you have the right to reproduce, right? There's a bundle of rights that come, and public performance is one of those. And so there's a different, revenue stream from performance income than what's called mechanical income from recordings. So yeah, there's a lot of issues to delve through.
as far as the case or no case on the wrongful death part, I think there's a potential case there. I think it's a lot harder than the De La Cruz Bell murder case or Bell death, accidental death, but it's still
Right.
negligent death. I would try to make it work. I'd research it. I think there's some value there, but you have to look at the economics of what Hector was at that time versus what De La Cruz was in his career. An aspiring musician for the economic
Right.
damage portion of it, meaning what do you expect him to make in his vocation, for De La Cruz is vastly higher than it would be for someone who's an aspiring musician that seems to just be getting by before his wife starts their successful shoe company.
Right. And I don't suppose we're going to analyze the other murder, which is in the afterlife where De La Cruz is murdered, right?
So I don't know if there's
Vengeance.
I don't know if there's ghost PI lawyers. I hope there are.
Right.
I think it's almost like a plot device to get him out of the rest of the
Right.
movie, because he once again at the Sunrise Spectacular, he tries to murder Miguel,
Right.
who's not really live or dead at this point, so it's unclear what happens if he
Right.
hits the ground if he's not rescued.
I know, right?
But the Alabrije comes and gets him and pulls him up there, and there's this lovely moment where his family's happy about it, and one of I think his aunts has put the camera on what's going on where De La Cruz,
Right, so everybody can see.
De La Cruz basically straight murders him and says you got to do whatever you
And
want.
confesses in front of everyone, right?
Right.
Ruins his reputation.
So at that point, he ends up getting slung into another bell. Bell falls on him again. And so does that cause the final death to get injured that way? It's not
I
really...
think it's not clear, but I guess we presume so, right? So
let's hope so.
Clever device, right? The bell gets him twice.
I think it's done well. But in the afterlife, I mean, as far as the PI lawyer, he's got some assets there. He's got that giant mountain of the visual.
Oh my gosh.
The afterlife is visually stunning in this movie. I mean, it's like this elevated, beautiful, colorful town.
Right.
Where it seems like you have to be in really good skeleton shape to go up and down that, because it's like being at, like we're both University of Tennessee fans, and if you ever
Yes.
go to Knoxville, it's a very hilly campus.
Yes,
And
quite the
so
workout.
this is a very hilly afterlife for these
But
people.
yeah, you can see that, the things that are left on the ofrenda by all of his fans. He's just accumulated a massive amount of wealth in the afterlife. So
He's a rich ghost, and so I think if I'm in the afterlife, I'd probably take that case too.
right.
But the one
Good to know.
the one I would like
Thought I'd
better,
ask.
the throwing Miguel off, the attempted murder.
Yeah.
And then also, I think, could Hector have a claim for him trying, because he basically he takes that picture, it ends up going away. That is, at that point, we believe Hector's only chance to be remembered.
To get back on the ofrenda, right.
That gets thrown in the water when Miguel goes off to the side, and he tries to kill him and tries to take out Hector to have the final death. He's
quite a character.
He's just a turkey all around. We're now going to move into our relevant evidence section, and I thought since we have this music law expert here that it'd be very interesting to talk about some of how these copyright lawsuits work. So there's been a number of them over the last few years, including one with Blurred Lines. I believe there was one with Ed Sheeran with Thinking Out Loud. Can you go over how those type of lawsuits work and what is usually at issue in those kind of cases?
Sure. And I'll start by saying that, we'll just presume we're under the 1976 Act at this point. If you take away one thing from listening to this podcast and you are an owner or creator of intellectual property, register your works with the Copyright Office. And the reason that that is so important is because registration is a prerequisite to bringing suit. There was a question that the Supreme Court answered a couple of years ago about whether if you had a registration pending for your work, you could then go ahead and sue, and the court said no. So you can't figure out, oh my gosh, someone's using my work, let me go run and file a registration, and then I can immediately sue. You have to wait for the Copyright Office to either accept the registration and issue a registration certificate or deny your registration. And so once you have your registration, one other important thing about that is you now can sue, and you're entitled potentially to some pretty big remedies. So you can get statutory damages, which are typically in a range of $30,000 to $150,000 per work, and you can get your attorney's fees. So you can still sue if you don't register your work prior to the infringement occurring, but you lose your right to those remedies. So then your remedies are things like actual damages, maybe disgorgement of profits, which just tend to be a lower dollar amount, or sometimes just a nominal amount.
Well, in these bigger cases, like, Blurred Lines, Think Out Loud, those were enormous hits.
Sure.
So with the 30 to 150, I think you said a minute ago, that wouldn't be nearly as much as actual profits or use of those songs.
Right, and you can elect which remedies you want to pursue.
Okay.
As once you have sort of the platter of remedies available to you, it's either or. So you can pick, right, which one is more lucrative. And attorneys take that into consideration when deciding whether they're going to sue or not, and advising our authors and owners of works about what their rights are. You're really looking at the economics of, does it make sense to sue because you can't get your attorney's fees, right? So every dollar that you spend on your lawyer is essentially a sunk cost from the attorney's fee side.
How are those cases evaluated? So I remember when that Blurred Lines case came out a few years ago, that was Robin Thicke and Pharrell, that the Marvin Gaye family, who was murdered by his own father at a relatively young age, it seems like they've been involved in a few of these. The news story I saw on it actually played part of the Marvin Gaye song they were suggesting was part of this. Mm-hmm. It didn't seem remotely similar to me.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not the music expert you are, but I mean, how do you make the leap from what Burrell wrote, got sued over it, to connecting those up? And I think that they ended up having to pay some money on that one.
They did, yeah. That was a very high-profile case. It was brought by a prominent plaintiff's intellectual property entertainment lawyer named Richard Bush. He's been involved in several high-profile copyright infringement claims on the plaintiff's side. There's a critical expert component to these cases, so you're looking at essentially whether there's been copying that is unlawful, right? And so the way you look at that is you have a musicologist that you've hired to come in and testify, give a report, testify about whether the two songs are substantially similar. That is a kind of a generalized overview, but the experts have become just critical in the litigation. And so for this case, and as for most of these high profile cases, it really becomes a battle of the experts. And the defense side experts are very well regarded. There are a small number of them. There has been some academic publications that have criticized sort of the power of these experts to shape what copyright law has become and how it is litigated. That case in particular, the Blurred Lines case, is not a favorite case by most intellectual entertainment lawyers in this sphere, mostly because of what you said, that the jury finding was obviously in favor of the plaintiffs, but the testimony of the expert for the plaintiffs was more about the feel of the songs and the vibe of the songs versus sort of an analytical musicologist analysis of bar by bar, line by line, etc.
That's such a hard standard. I mean, as I've grown up, there's been all these different segments of music that have been popular at different times. I mean, in the 80s when I was a kid, a lot of the music had a kind of a similar vibe. You get into the late 80s, early 90s when you have the hair metal. A lot of it sounded a lot the same.
Right.
The grunge music, a lot of it was very similar.
Absolutely. And there's
going into hip hop. I mean, even now you have time. I mean, if you go onto the radio right now, like our daughters love Taylor Swift. Gracie Abrams sounds a lot like Taylor Swift.
Sure.
And they all have kind of a similar vibe about them. And I don't think they're trying to take from each other. I think it's just that's what the popular music is right now.
Well, and some of the analysis turns on, is what was copied, the bar of music, is it creative enough or original enough to be protectable? And so there's been a bit of a blurring on that question, right, from the musicologist standpoint about, looking at what's called prior art, which is a concept that comes from patent law about whether this particular run of notes or melodic changes or whatever existed in other works that were, could be pulled from, because there are some kind of music foundation building blocks. And this is, I think, a legitimate point that there's only so many ways to really write a song, right? And so some of that becomes really just the building blocks of a song that are not protectable, because then you have exclusivity over that, which limits the creative opportunities for other artists. And so there is that tension in the law about where to draw that line. Some academics think that the line has gone too far, sort of into a blending over into what's called like a novelty standard from patent law versus an originality standard for copyright or sufficient creative expression. That standard is pretty low. And I don't know if people kind of generally know this, but under copyright law, really they're concerned about copying. And so you can have two songwriters that write identical songs or write identical riffs, and both of those works, assuming they're sufficiently creative, are protectable, independently by copy. They're not infringing each other, right? That is permitted under the Copyright Act. And so, yeah, that's what you're essentially looking at in these cases. And the Ed Sheeran case, which was a recent sort of high-profile case, he went to the jury and testified. He had some very, very good lawyers from Pryor Cashman representing him, and he went and played for the jury, how he wrote the song, how he put the song together, to rebut this allegation that he had copied from the plaintiffs.
And he was successful in that case,
He was
right?
successful, right? And I credit his attorneys for that, but also him.
Who gets involved in these cases? We talked about Pharrell and Robin Thicke. You talked earlier about the different layers of ownership. So is the production company involved? Is the record label, are they going to be involved? All these people are going to be all in this one suit?
It depends, which is a great lawyer answer. It depends. It depends on what the work is that's being exploited and who the owners are, right? So you might have the publishing company suing over use of the composition. If there are samples that are used, right, which is an actual recording that's embodying the composition, right? Sampling was kind of a big thing in prior iterations of rap and hip hop. Then you might have the record label, right, because they typically own the recordings and the publishers own the compositions, in conjunction a lot of times with the writers. And so, yes, you would have those entities, but a lot of times they will add, like the artists in their deals have the right to participate in those cases contractually. They negotiate for the right to hire their own attorney if they want to and to consult on the litigation, so they may or may not be a party. If you're on the plaintiff side, you're always suing everybody who's touched the work. So you're suing as many people as you can. That's sort of a general rule, I think, of litigation, is sue everyone and see who you can get to stick. But you will see publishers and writers and record labels as defendants.
It seems difficult because on one point you want to protect your artist, but you also don't want to stifle creativity for new things getting out in the world either.
Right, yeah, that's the balance that the Copyright Act has been seeking to strike since its formation, since its creation.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us this week on the Pop Culture Courtroom, and special thanks to Lauren Kilgore.
Yeah, it was my absolute pleasure.
We loved you being here, and we'll see you next time.
Look forward to the next one.
The Pop Culture Courtroom is a Matt Hardin Law production.
If you're a loved one that's been injured in a car wreck or other personal injury incident, call the law firm, the Tennesseans Trust.
Visit matthardinlaw.com or call 615-200-1111 for your free consultation today.